For several decades, many Peruvians and Americans have fought over something which has been setting so many setbacks in advancing their own country. And since then, the lives and rights of the men and women in those countries, and possibly even other countries, have gradually gone downhill, like dominoes. There's this practice in which so many government officials believe is the right thing to do. That is, of course, corruption. In political terms, corruption is dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, which usually involves bribery, therefore making the citizens depraved morally. There are always lawyers and leaders who just want power for themselves. They want to be the only people ruling a whole country, because apparently nobody else is trusted according to them. And when something bad happens to them, or when they do something bad to themselves or others, it is obvious that the lawyers and leaders may get exposed embarrassingly by their own citizens. But the problem is, when this happens, the leaders and lawyers will try their best to fabricate or hide the evidence for the sake of their own safety, to save their own skin. It is really funny, but also at the same time disappointing to see the honest civilians get imprisoned for, quote-unquote, obstructing the justice of their own country, when really what they are doing is they want to see and want to improve the country for the good. This is literally limiting the rights of men and women, and there are many reasons as to why this happens in America and Peru, but it's not well understood about the governments, how the governments usually should work, and how corruption occurs between the two nations, traditionally speaking, according to their own respective constitutions. The United States, to begin with, is a federal presidential constitutional republic, as stated by the White House. Its whole government is divided into three different branches, which is the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Their powers are influenced under the U.S. Constitution in the Congress, the President, and the federal courts, respectively. In the Congress, to be specific, the upper house contains the Senate, while the lower house contains the House of Representatives, which is the White House. On the other hand, there is Peru. Peru is a unitary semi-presidential republic with a constantly changing constitution, the most recent constitution being ratified in 1993 due to several other coups beforehand. Regardless, ideally, its government, which is primarily under the hands of the president, is popularly elected under 5-year terms, but prohibited from serving consecutively if re-elected. The president appoints the cabinet, the council of ministers, and is assisted in government roles and activities by the leader of the council of ministers, which is the prime minister in this case, who is also appointed by the president as well as 2 other popularly elected vice presidents. Legislative power is practiced under the unicameral Congress of the Republic, whose members are elected for 5-year terms. Or just simply summarize it as 2 democratic nations with a flawed democracy, with different types of presidential systems, and of course, a teeny tiny bit of corruption. Speaking about corruption and these kind of things, the United States, to be specific, has a notorious reputation for their roles and actions about their own government, as well as foreign affairs, internationally speaking here. Correspondingly, according to a global report conducted back in 2020, the United States dropped low to a 67 out of a maximum possible score of 100, down from a 76 back in 2015. This means that with that analogy in mind, the lower the score, the worse the corruption there is present in that specific country. The United States in this case. In other words, this means that the corruption in the United States is apparently at its worst in almost a decade, or possibly even more than that. But that's just the statistics counting for now. In a similar way, according to Scott Graytack's research, he mentioned a larger decay when it came to U.S. political institutions as a major contributor to the nation's declining rating. Later in that same article, Graytack also mentioned that the public opinion in American elections, to be specific, have been undermined by misinformation and embezzlement in elections, especially in 2020 and 2016. Graytech then suggested that money laundering was prevalent in American banks, where they transferred suspicious money to drug kingpins, power-hungry kleptocrats, as well as terrorists to distribute corrupt cash elsewhere. According to the 2020 Index of Corruption, it shows that how global corruption has made countries get setbacks on their leaders' abilities to even protect the lives and economies of their citizens, especially during the times of the COVID pandemic. With COVID in mind, it is a great point to argue that the COVID-19 pandemic is not only a health and economic crisis, but at the same time, it is rather a corruption crisis. This shows the carelessness of how the president could care a lot less about the pandemic, but rather money himself. In this case, because of several patients being admitted to clinics and relying that much on Medicare or Medicaid, even health systems that could just fail, since they are also vulnerable to corruption. McKinnon and Griffin in an article came up with the theory that the more corrupt a nation is, the less money was spent on healthcare, regardless of economic development. Finally, because of the American government attempting to lean over an authoritarian autocracy due to Trump's 2021 coup d'etat attempt on Capitol Hill, the majority of the government since then began to seize and censor the criticism about it, making it a lame excuse to silence critics. Not only that, but to take away civil liberties and increase surveillance. This means the increasing levels of corruption would actually correlate to the public's distrust, as well as several unorthodox tactics to control the pandemic. Because corruption is prevalent globally in other supposedly democratic countries, then this means that the high levels of corruption continue to persist over there too, especially in most of Asia, Africa, and even Latin America too. More specifically in Peru as well. Corruption in Peru is a greater concern compared to the United States due to several years of the nation being under a military junta, as well as racism, classism, public distrust being well behind human development, greater censorship, and even several Fujimorist political parties overtaking the other opposing parties. Fujimorismo is the policies and ideology which was named after former President Alberto Fujimori of Peru, 1991 to 2000. Based on his policies and personality called around him, Fujimorismo as an ideology has a reputation of leaning towards the alt-right. The ideology consists of national conservatism, Christian nationalism, right-wing populism, social conservatism, neoliberalism, anti-communism, as well as Peruvian nationalism especially. The ideology can be defined as a form of authoritarianism, supporting neoliberal economics, opposition to communism, extremely conservative stances like, for example, opposition to LGBT rights, in school curriculums that involve gender equality, and their sex ed lessons. People against this ideology are called the Fujimorista. Ever since 2017, Peru has been struggling with a large nationwide political crisis, where Peruvian political parties based on the Fujimorismo ideology have been attempting to eliminate every other opposing political party, because apparently they want power for themselves. Literally every president of Peru since the 1980s has been arrested and tried on corruption charges. Although, technically speaking, corruption is not a crime, the Peruvian government makes it like it is one. The distrust of Peruvian lives have increased as the situation went downhill over the years. Protests and riots related to the crisis have escalated since 2020. What's even worse is that the Peruvian presidency terms can end in a catastrophic disaster, especially during the recent events that happened in December 2022, when Juan Pedro Castillo was ousted for attempting a coup by attempting to dissolve Congress and a planned installation of a new provisional government. This stunned many leaders across the spectrum, even including his allies. As stated in the New York Times article, many government officials of Peru resigned en masse. It was later declared unconstitutional by that move. The nation's armed forces and police issued a joint statement saying that they won't support Castillo. After Castillo was removed from power as president of Peru, he was then arrested. Shortly afterwards, his vice president, Dina Boluarte, was sworn in as president and became the first woman to lead the Peruvian nation. This was a very dramatic yet abrupt end to Castillo's presidency, which was, according to Peruvians, the first leftist politician to be elected Peru's president in ages. Some background: Castillo was a former farmer, teacher, and union activist. He had campaigned just the previous year on a promise to rectify the dying economy and get rid of the high rates of poverty among poor Peruvians, which had gradually worsened throughout the pandemic. His attempt at seizing power eclipsed a similar movement from Alberto Fujimori 30 years prior. Digging a little deeper, Fujimori was a populist outsider who was elected in 1990. 2 years later, he staged a coup to abolish Congress along with the military and ruled Peru until 2000 when he resigned. According to the Peruvian government, Fujimori is still in prison on charges of corruption and human rights abuses. Even beforehand, Castillo had survived 2 other impeachment attempts for not garnering sufficient votes, despite their administration being extremely corrupt. In a similar way, Peru has become more and more notorious for its corruption scandals, resulting in 6 different presidents since 2016. He was given power after spurious votes favored him. Fed up by decades of discrimination, corruption scandals, criminal investigations, and high unemployment, Castillo turned 80 ministers and filled posts with his allies who lacked any experience, those in which they were investigated for corruption and murder especially. In other terms, Castillo is literally making a criminal gang with lawmakers and his own family members by profiting off other government contracts and repeatedly obstructing justice. Like, for example, her daughter getting arrested but his cabinet claiming that she went missing by kidnappers. Dramatically speaking, it was only a matter of hours before Castillo could have dissolved Congress. However, the vote of impeaching him saved the Peruvian government to some extent. In a similar way, Castillo's decision to dissolve Congress worsened the already failing democracy into its lowest in its current political crisis for years. His announcement had little to no support. As stated, the police stated that Castillo lacked any legal right to carry out his coup. The police even attempted to simmer down the population by telling them, respect state institutions, and to reject breaking the age-old constitution. Even the United States Embassy in Lima also condemned Castillo. That particular embassy said in a tweet saying, "We urge Castillo to reverse his attempt to dissolve Congress and allow freer institutions in Peru to work as the Constitution states." Benji Espinosa, the president's former lawyer, said to the RPP, "I am a defender of the democratic order of the Constitution, and I am deeply convinced that politics cannot be above the law, because you can't have politics being above the law, because laws and politics are politics." After publicly telling RPP, Espinosa resigned. In a similar way, Castillo had once made an earlier attempt at publicly dissolving Progress the month before by surveying military leaders about supporting him. Fearing a military coup on social media, Castillo's former defense minister, who had already resigned since then, discussed the fears of an upcoming military coup d'etat against the president. This led to opposition leaders to stay the night in Congress, fearing a coup planned by the armed forces to destroy the chamber. Fortunately, this never happened. Poignantly, the leader of Peru's army also resigned. And it came to pass that after 2 hours of Castillo making the announcement, Congress voted to impeach the president, voting 101 in favor over 6 against. According to the Peruvian government, he was last seen leaving the presidential palace in a car as the latter entered the police station, and then later entered a police station, which then the prosecutor charged him with rebellion. The police then stated Castillo will be held in the same prison that Fujimori is currently serving his sentence in, outside of Lima. Afterwards, Boullarte was sworn in as the new leader of Peru, with the currently vacant position for vice president. Boullarte then promised to rescue the country from incompetence and corruption within Peru. Boullarte then called for a truce between Peru's political parties in order to re-establish national unity and return to economic growth. Boullarte was a former leader and member of the Marxist-based party, until she was ousted for criticizing the leader. She used to serve as Minister of Development and Social Inclusion until Castillo formed another cabinet that caused her to resign the month before. Though considered not well known, according to recent polls, Peruvians favored new general elections replacing Castillo in office where he was impeached. Finally, back in 2020, 2 years before the incident, former President Martin Vizcarra, who was ousted before Castillo, resigned after the vote. However, he then filed an appeal before the Constitutional Tribunal, which was declined. The successor resident lasted only less than a week in office, and then the next successor governed Peru for 8 months until Castillo took office. Once the public learned about Castillo's arrest, they finally celebrated in the area where he was arrested, in front of a police station in Lima. With all that fiasco in mind, all this shows that democracy is currently and still being challenged because of how it is being practiced. Especially now, Peru's development in democracy and its economy had been failing since the start of the crisis in 2017. With the new president in office, hope is present for a matter of time. Hope is there that one day Peru can finally improve without Fujimorists setting the country back over and over again. For example, back when Fujimori was president, he imposed forced sterilization against farmers living in remote villages, which is, I think, a major crime against humanity that the Peruvian government perpetrated. But since then, Peru has improved to some extent, but not to a scale in which it is fully free. Hopefully that can be achieved one day. And this all happened because of the United States forcing new governments against communism and fascism, causing most of Latin America to be under military juntas after the events of World War II and during the course of the Cold War. What's ironic is that even the military dictatorial leaders still had qualities of extreme socialism and fascism too, even though they claim to be against that. What's also ironic is that the government still wants to hide their flaws when they are already exposing themselves that easily. Life has not been easy to the poor people who lived under years of censorship and very strict laws. Corruption has existed ever since the very start of civilization, with people imposing slavery, bribery, kleptocracy, embezzlement, and distrust. They had since then exploited the minds of their own citizens. The people were always being dictated in what to and what not to think and say for the country. Unfortunately, at this time, it is just sad to say that most of the world isn't free enough because of people wanting absolute power, massacres against the population, loads of poverty, and lack of education and medical care. This should hopefully change as the rest of the free world is advancing a whole lot more compared to most of Latin America and Africa. A lot of people just wish for a less corrupt world so that they can actually trust the government for once, obtain free and fair elections, and live whatever life they want to live in without the government spying on and controlling them like mannequins of some sort. Once the whole world decides to finally agree on making a freer world, the world will advance a whole lot more, and Peru, especially, will become a political haven, as well as the United States. Finally, all this shows how corruption can ruin lives and benefit only the people who support the cause. This also shows how hard they try to stop corruption as much as they can.